how do you get 200 people to leave their daily work and make a pilgrimage to this wood and spend time wrapping ropes around stones and dragging them across the landscape all the way to where you want to build the monument?
Now, Stonehenge, I have to admit, is not something I think about often in my day-to-day life, but I thought a lot about Stonehenge, of course, and certainly the characters in your novel are thinking quite deeply about the construction of this place. The way you write about Stonehenge gives those of us who haven't had the chance to visit a visceral sense of the power that this towering monument has on the world around it and had for the people who lived during the time that it was built. What is the most impressive to you about Stonehenge?
The first thing is the size of these stones. They're 7 or 8 yards high, and they weigh about 25 tons. And when you stand close to these enormous stones, you get a feeling that you're next to something that's really special. It's really extraordinary. It's been there for 4,500 years, and nobody knows why. So it's immediately arresting like that. And of course, so that caught my interest. But what happened was, as I learned more and more about it, I became more and more interested, because there are several questions about Stonehenge. Who built it? How did they build it? And why did they build it? And once I got into that and started finding out what answers there are, imagining answers to the questions that we don't know the answer to, and it began to turn into a novel.
What sparked that desire in you to learn more about Stonehenge? What was the thing that made you think, I need to know more about how this monument got here?
It's kind of a funny thing, really, but I saw a book. I didn't even read this book at the time, although I have since. I just saw the title, and the title was How to Build Stonehenge. And I thought, wow, that sounds like a Ken Follett book. And of course, I read the book and eventually got to know the author, who's an archaeologist called Mike Pitts, and began to get into the intricacies of this place. But that was the spark. The spark was just that title.
Well, How to Build Stonehenge, a nonfiction, I presume, almost sounds like a manual if we wanted to do it now. These were quite primitive people that built Stonehenge, and it's quite a marvel that it was even possible to move, as you say, these 25-ton stones.
You are so right.
Yeah, people are moving them often without animals. They don't have, like, the wheel, things that are so simple. What did you learn about how one builds Stonehenge?
Well, it's kind of elimination. As you've said, no wheels, so no carts. They did not yet have the idea of getting horses and cattle to pull stuff for them. So it must have been, these stones must have been moved by human beings. Now, we know where the stones came from. They come from a wood called Westwood, which is about 17 miles north of Stonehenge. We know that human beings must have pulled the stones over the ground. There are other theories. There's a theory that it was built by aliens from outer space, which was one that I didn't spend much time considering. There was a more sensible theory that it might have come at least partly by water. And there is a river near Stonehenge called the Hampshire Avon, but it's not big enough. You think about a 25-ton stone. The raft carrying that stone would have to be about twice as big. You'd need the Mississippi. The River Avon just isn't anywhere near big enough and can't have been big enough even 4,500 years ago. So really, by elimination, we think they must have tied ropes around these stones, and we do know that they had ropes. They made ropes out of honeysuckle vines. And some archaeologists, there's a kind of branch of archaeology which is called experimental archaeology, in which archaeologists do experiments and try stuff out. And several times now, they've got hold of a stone that's roughly the size of the Stonehenge stones and weighs about 25 tons. And they've tied ropes around it and they've experimented to see how many people it takes to shift it. And the answer is about 200. So it's likely, everything about the Stone Age is a guess, but the best guess for the movement of these giant stones is that they were roped and pulled along by about 200 people, which raises another question. How do you get 200 people to leave their daily work and make a pilgrimage to this wood and spend time wrapping ropes around stones and dragging them across the landscape all the way to where you want to build the monument? So as well as the kind of technical questions, how did they do it? There's also a sort of social question. How did they persuade people to spend all that time and effort moving those stones?
One thing that's very clear in the way that you're describing kind of the research that goes into this novel and the research that archaeologists have done about the Stone Age and the construction of monuments like Stonehenge is that we don't have a ton to go on in terms of, like, there's no written records about this period of time. It can be quite difficult to discern what life was like for people living on this Great Plain in England at the time that you're writing about. How did that lack of historical record affect you in your telling of this first prehistoric novel? Because in other historic novels you've written, you've had kind of a lot more to go on in crafting your story.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Every historical novel has a basis of historical fact, and then the author imagines on top of that some of the things that might have happened. And it was the same with Circle of Days for me, except that the basis of historical fact is smaller. So my imagination had to work harder.
And how did that feel, I guess, having to work your imagination harder? Was that daunting at all to you to have to kind of rely a bit more on constructing what this world looked like and felt like based on just sort of, again, this guesswork and process of elimination?
Daunting is not the word. Look, this is what I do. If there's one thing that I've got, it's imagination. And so it wasn't difficult in that way. In fact, it was quite fun. I did a lot more world building with Circle of Days than I've done with previous historical novels. I had to, for example, Stonehenge as a monument, it looks and feels as if it might be religious. What was their religion? Well, we don't know. As you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, there are no written records because they didn't have reading and they didn't have writing. At the time, 4,500 years ago, reading and writing were being invented in the Middle East, but they had not come as far as Western Europe. And so there are no written records. And I just had to. We look at Stonehenge. It's oriented towards the rising sun on Midsummer Day and the setting sun on Midwinter Day. Quite precise. So what does that tell us? Well, if their religion might well have had something to do with the sun. And what I've done in Circle of Days is I have made them sun worshippers because it seems logical. It's another guess. Nobody knows. Possibly nobody ever will know, but it's plausible.
I definitely want to return to these questions of religion and spirituality because I think in different ways, questions of religion, spirituality, the lengths that people are willing to go to in service of some kind of spirituality is at the heart of so many of the historical novels that you write. But I want to rest for a little bit longer on this question of language because, as you say, these are people that don't have reading and writing, people that would have had some way of communicating with one another. But you do get into almost this kind of more primitive voice, like a simpler way of thinking. There are certain abstract concepts that these people don't even quite have the language to describe. Counting above like 30 is a challenge for these people. They're having to invent kind of in real time ways to do it. What was it like having to write characters who have that kind of mindset or way of looking at the world?
Well, I happen to have a friend who's a professor of cognitive neuropsychology, and he's very interested in counting and numbers. And so I talked to him about it, and he explained to me the different ways of counting that preceded the way we count today. And because I have, in the story, I have different kinds of people. There are hunter-gatherers who are sort of technologically at very early stages. Then there are herders, and then there are farmers, and they're all different. The business of counting, there are people in the world today, hunter-gatherers in the world today, who only have 4 numbers, and those numbers are 1, a pair, another 1, and a lot. There are a few people left who count on the body. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and after that, for 21, you touch your wrist, elbow for 22, shoulder for 23. Count it, that's called counting on the body, and that still exists today. But of course, my people studied the motions of the sun. They studied the skies. It was an intellectual process. And so I decided it was very likely that they had got to the point where they counted in tens. Could have been 20s. I mean, some early counting systems are based on 20 rather than 10. But 10 is the most common because it's the easiest. You look at your hands and you see 10 fingers. So I thought it would be interesting to show in the community of the Great Plain that the 3 different systems of counting could coexist.
Mm. You mentioned having a friend that kind of introduced you to the concept of these 3 particular groups. How did you develop the distinct identities of those 3 groups? Like, what informed the personalities of the herders versus the farmers versus the woodlanders?
Well, I think the kind of society that people create depends to some extent on how they make their living. So I decided that the farmers would be quite concerned with private property. You know, a farmer says, this is my field, and these are my goats, and this is my dairy. And the farmer, I'm going to say he, because usually a man was in charge of a farm, and he is very possessive about these things. Whereas the herders would have had about 2,000 cattle on Salisbury Plain. I call it the Great Plain in the book. It's nowadays called Salisbury Plain. They would have had about 2,000 cattle. It would have been very difficult, maybe impossible, to know which cow belonged to which person. And so I decided they probably owned these beasts communally. So we've got one society that has private property and one society that doesn't. And then I was thinking about the role of women. And in most human societies, for the last 12,000 years, since civilization was invented, since farming was invented, most societies, women have been property. Even today, if you think about the marriage service, there's usually a man who gives away the bride. Isn't that a funny thing to say? Gives away the bride to another man. So we still have a vestige in Western Europe and North America of this system whereby a woman was somebody's property. And I think that's why I think the farmers, the women in the farmer society would have been under subjection to the men. I was thinking the kind of society they have and the rules they have about property and marriage and so on will depend on how they make their living, whether they're farmers or herders or hunter-gatherers.
It's interesting. There are a lot of questions that kind of arise for me about how much of how humans behave in groups and in relationship to one another is inherent and like part of, what we would call, I'm doing air quotes, human nature, and how much is a bit of a product of how our societies are structured. Because, you have these Stone Age characters that in many ways are dealing with what we would consider in 2025 very human problems, right? These are also characters that are dealing with conflicts in their family, dealing with the perhaps tension between duty to one's parents and siblings versus a desire to strike out on one's own. People dealing with, how do we mediate disputes between people? Do we use violence or do we talk about it? People, deciding who they want to partner up with and what kind of a romantic relationship that they want to be in. How did you, try to address, again, what I would call these very human problems in this, Stone Age context? What informed how these people were going to go about mediating these things?
Well, see, I think one of the joys of literature is that it allows you to speculate about this stuff. And the only test is it plausible? And if you do it badly, well, readers are going to say, well, that couldn't have happened. I don't believe that. So that's really a feature of all novels, but particularly of historical novels. The author is speculating, and the test is it plausible? But there are some things which I think must be common to all human societies. And if you write about those things, you touch, as it were, the basis of human identity. So, for example, in every historical age, people are anxious about, for example, money and work, making a living, feeding your children. People are anxious about violence, crime and war, or they're anxious about marriage and sex. And if you write about these things, all of these things were issues in pretty much every human society, as far as I can make out.
I want to kind of take a larger view of your career and the massive success that you've had writing these historical novels that, as you say, are like very situated in specific times and places that are very English. The Pillars of the Earth I mentioned earlier is your most popular novel. It was your sort of first foray into this older kind of historical fiction as opposed to the more recent historical like spy thrillers that you started off writing. But at the time that you published Pillars of the Earth, I understand it was not really a foregone conclusion that it was going to be any kind of success at all, let alone a runaway success. Take me back to the moment that you decided, I want to dive into this novel about building a cathedral.
Well, my publishers were very worried about it. And they said, so, Ken, it's about building a church. Yes. In the Middle Ages? Yes. Ken, are you sure? They were very worried that I was going to produce, they were worried about how it would be received by people who were used to me writing about spies and the CIA and the KGB and the Nazis and all that kind of thing. And it was not unreasonable of them to be a little nervous about this. And at first, the sales of the book it wasn't a flop or anything, but it wasn't a tearaway success either. It sold sort of fairly reasonably well. And I was disappointed because I really thought I'd written something special. I mean, it'd taken me more than 3 years, and it had been difficult to write, and I thought I'd produced something quite different. And there was not much of a fuss about it. And then slowly I began to realize that people were taking this book to their hearts in a way that hadn't happened to me before. But it was a slow burn. And gradually, it went from being a book that nobody had taken much notice of to a book that people remembered and talked about. And so it stays in your memory, and the Pillars of the Earth. People are still talking to me about characters in the Pillars of the Earth, like William Hamley, who's a horrible guy, who's a villain, and this book came out in 1989, so it's not long before it'll be 40 years, I guess. And is that right? Yeah, I guess it is nearly 40 years. So it stays in people's memory, and that's kind of important. And so in the end, having been something that my publishers were really not very keen on, something that wasn't much of a big success when it was first published, it became, as you mentioned, my most popular book.
Ken, we've been speaking about this incredible career that you've had writing these historical novels, from your latest to Circle of Days to going back in time to your first turn to the historical with The Pillars of the Earth. But you didn't start out writing historical novels, and I understand that you weren't even that big of a history buff always. You didn't enjoy history in school. You stopped studying it at the earliest possible opportunity and then returned to this historical study later on. What made you become someone who was interested in really delving into history?
I started to get interested in history when I had a reason. History can history can be dry as dust, can't it? I mean, and especially if it's taught badly in schools. Schools are very good at putting people off stuff, you know. There are teachers who can put you off Shakespeare for life or Dickens. And certainly there were teachers who could make you think that history was a boring thing to do. When I was writing thrillers, I thought, the story will be much more interesting if what the spy is doing has some connection with a battle or a war that the reader knows about. So I began to read military history, looking for moments in wars when the work of a spy could have changed the course of history. And that was when I got really interested in history. And I went from military history to finding dramatic situations and wonderful plots in different historical periods.
How did you get into writing these thrillers while also working as a journalist? I believe you had a variety of jobs, like working for the paper, doing like radio, TV, like different things as like a sort of job horse back in the day.
Yeah. I was working as a newspaper reporter, and I was in the evenings. I was writing short stories and sending them to magazines. None of those stories were ever published. But then I had a financial crisis. My car broke down, and it was going to cost £200 to repair it, and I didn't have £200. I went to the bank and asked them to lend me the money to get my car fixed, and they said no. And so I was kind of stuck. But a colleague of mine on the newspaper had written a thriller, and he got it published, and we were all in the newsroom. You know, we were all really interested in this. We asked him, "How did you find time to write a book?" And how did you find a publisher? And how much money did you make? And he said £200, which was exactly what I needed. So it was a light bulb moment. And so I started to write a thriller, and I sent it to the same publisher who liked it and gave me £200, and I got my car fixed. Now, I wrote that first book very quickly. It wasn't really very good. It was obviously good enough to be published, but it wasn't a big success. But I thought I had really enjoyed writing it. And I thought, well, maybe if I try harder next time, I'll write something that could be a bestseller. Well, that took a while. But my first bestseller was my 11th book, my 11th attempt to write a world bestseller, and that was Eye of the Needle, which was, in fact, a world bestseller. And, from then on, my future was decided.
I want to actually ask about a different kind of writing that you've done, which is an essay that you wrote in Granta back in 2016 called Bad Faith. I mentioned earlier that I did want to eventually circle back to the question of spirituality. And this is a bit of a different piece of writing for you because you're speaking about your spiritual journey, beginning with your childhood. You grew up as a member of a sort of like low church Protestant sect, I would call it, the Plymouth Brethren. Can you describe what the Plymouth Brethren are for people who don't maybe know them, and how your family's relationship with that group affected your life as a boy and affected your journey into writing?
Well, the Plymouth Brethren are a very Puritan sect, and they believe that every word of the Bible is literally true, and every biblical rule must be followed. And the upshot was that when I was a boy, we didn't have TV, we didn't have a radio. And every Saturday morning, the local cinema would show movies for kids, and all my friends went. I was the only person who didn't go, which outraged me. Now, actually, looking back, instead of going to the movie house, I went to the public library. I joined the public library when I was 7 years old, and reading was my great pleasure. And it probably, in the long run, that might have been more use to me than going to watch, Flash and Billy the Kid and all those movies. So looking back, I don't really regret it. But at the time, I was absolutely outraged at this restriction. But more seriously, I got to the age of about 13 or 14, and I started to say, my father would say, well, you have to do, this is what the Bible says. And I would say, how do you know the Bible's true? And this was a discussion, not to call it a row, a discussion between me and my father for a matter of years. And I eventually decided that they didn't know that the Bible was true. And some of it might be true, some of it might not be true. And I actually, when I went to university, I studied philosophy because I thought it might help me resolve this issue. Because it's quite difficult to go against your parents' religion. You're rejecting the thing that your parents think is the most important thing in life. And that's difficult to do even if you've got logic on your side. But philosophy did help me. And within 6 months of studying philosophy at University College London, I was an atheist. And I still am, although nowadays I call myself a lapsed atheist. Because, of course, there is something else in life that isn't just logic and facts. And it was really my love of cathedrals that brought me back to some kind of wish for a spiritual life. And I'm an atheist who likes going to church. That's why I call myself lapsed. I love to go to the cathedrals. My favorite service is choral evening song. This is a great experience. Anybody who's going to Britain for a tour or a holiday or anything, it's a great thing to do on Saturday evening. The cathedrals have good choirs. The singing is terrific. The architecture is wonderful, especially by candlelight. I like the words of the Bible. You know, we use the King James Bible, which is a very well-written translation of the original books of the Bible. And all of that, and I find what I get is a feeling of spiritual peace. And that's really quite important, especially in the kind of hectic lives that we live in the 21st century, to go somewhere that gives you a sense of spiritual peace. So I haven't come full circle because this liking of mine for being in a church at a solemn service, I still don't believe, in the story of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes and all that kind of thing. I don't believe any of that. But I do believe that something happens in a great church, and it doesn't have to be a Christian church. It could be a great temple of another religion, or doesn't have to be in a temple at all necessarily. It could be in Stonehenge. You could go to Stonehenge and you could have that same feeling of, my goodness, I'm in the presence of something that has been here for 4,500 years, and people have been coming here all of that time. And so I've eventually come around to liking to go to church without everything that goes with it.
There's so much in that answer that is absolutely fascinating to me and that I want to dive into. But one question that I have, I suppose, is do you have perhaps like a favorite cathedral or a moment that you first experienced that sense of awe as you say, an atheist who's kind of rediscovering some of the feeling of peace and serenity, fulfillment, like whatever sense of awe that one can have when you're entering these real architectural marvels, that beautiful cathedrals often are?
I do remember when I must have been 22 or 23, going to an English town called Peterborough, where there's a very lovely cathedral. And the front of the cathedral, the west front of the cathedral, has 3 huge arches. They look like doorways for giants to walk through. And I remember standing, looking at that, and wow is not an adequate word for how I felt looking at that. And that was the spark. And I went inside and looked at the nave and the regularity of the arches along the nave, and I sort of, my feeling for cathedrals didn't develop instantly then, but I instantly knew that I was somewhere absolutely fascinating, and that was a good instinct because it's still fascinating me all these years later.
I do have a question. You mention these again, as you said, not rows, but disagreements. These disagreements that you would have with your father in particular about religion, about whether the literal text of the Bible was true. And it sounds like it was a very tense time. You know, it can be a tense time being a teenager generally, having disagreements about values, about how you want to live your life with your parents, particularly when it's about something that's of such great significance to your parents as religion. Mm-hmm. How did your conversations with your parents around religion evolve over time after you went through kind of that realization of, I'm not going to share the faith of my parents as an adult?
Well, we became a little bit distant. I mean, my parents were not unkind people at all. They were loving people, and and I and my sister and brother were cherished and looked after, and we didn't feel neglected. I mean, the arguments were very much on an intellectual level, so I don't criticize them at all for that. But it did mean that I, for a long time, I never really talked to them about anything deeply important. And I don't know if they really understood my feelings about cathedrals. You see, they would have thought that a cathedral embodied a lot of extravagance that they disapproved of. The statues, they really weren't comfortable with statues of saints and the Virgin Mary and paintings of the prophets and all that kind of thing. They felt that people would be tempted to worship the image rather than the actual, rather than God. And I mean, there are a lot of people who think that, and there are a lot of religion often forbids you to make a picture of what is supposed to be.
Not make a graven image or whatever the phrasing is. Yeah,
it's the exact phrase, a graven image. And so they didn't like cathedrals. I mean, I don't know. I'd be surprised if they ever went into a cathedral more than once or twice. And so my return to liking some aspects of religion was also alien to them. So really, we were never able to talk much about that.
How have you approached these subjects of religion and spirituality as a father and a grandfather? Like, are your beliefs around this shared by other members of your family, or have they themselves developed sort of different relationships to these things?
Well, my children and grandchildren are a great deal more relaxed about these matters than I ever was. My generation. My generation was troubled by this stuff, and my children and my grandchildren are not troubled by it. Thinking about it, I don't think there's one of my grandchildren who is a regular churchgoer, But you know, I mean, this is the world today. Very few people now, relatively speaking, certainly in Europe. I know in North America people are keener on going to church, but in Europe, very few people go to church, and so you know, my son came home from school one day and told us stories about Jesus, which he said were true. And I said, well, these are stories. They aren't necessarily true. And he didn't understand that, really. And I said, well, think of Noddy. I don't know if you know the books about Noddy.
I know Noddy, but I don't know how ubiquitous it is in Canada. So this is like Enid Blyton children's stories, right? Yeah.
These are stories for very small children, and they're stories about a toy, a little toy called Noddy, who wears a funny hat, and he drives a little car and he has adventures. And so I said, look, you like the stories about Noddy, and there are stories about Jesus, and you know, there's no such person as Noddy, and there may not have been anybody called Jesus. We don't really know. We got in terrible trouble with the school. We were this was with my first wife. We were summoned to the school, and we were told that we couldn't corrupt the children in this way by telling them that Jesus was like Noddy. And so from then on, I was very careful to say to children, look, don't tell your teacher this, but you don't have to believe, you know, anything that they tell you in religious lessons in school.
What year was this, out of curiosity, that this happened?
This must have been about 1975.
Yeah, fair play. I can imagine that not having gone over well in 1975, I suppose.
Right.
I mean, there's places it wouldn't go over now well either, to be fair.
Yeah.
I don't know how it would have. I went to Catholic school. I don't know how it would have gone down there, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
I want to return, since we are speaking in sort of the wake of the publication of this new novel, Circle of Days. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about cathedrals that there's many spaces where you've experienced a sense of awe in your life, visiting cathedrals and having that be an inspiration for the novels about cathedrals that you've written, but also Stonehenge is clearly a place that has inspired much awe and much artistic inspiration in you. Just as a last question, for folks who haven't had the opportunity to visit themselves, how would you describe the feeling of Stonehenge? Sell me on why I should go if I was thinking about it.
Well, you will see something that is nothing like anything you've ever seen before. There are other stone circles in the UK and in Western Europe, and there are some in Japan and Turkey, but they are not like Stonehenge. Stonehenge, when it was first built, was the most elaborate stone circle ever, and the most contrived, the most designed. And the stones were sculpted. Most stone circles, nothing has been done to the stones. They've just been moved and put down in a rough circle. Stonehenge, they're sculpted, they're smoothed, and so you'll see something that immediately strikes you as awesome, and at the same time intriguing, because you can't help but think, what is this doing here? What is the story of this place? That is what happens when you look at Stonehenge. And as you know, we've talked, and you know that in as much as there is a story, there are certain things that are known. And if you want any help in imagining some more, then I've done some of that work for you.
Well, brilliant sales pitch, both for the concept of Stonehenge and for your new novel, Circle of Days. Ken, thank you so much for joining me. I have to say, this is the most I've ever thought about Stonehenge in my life, reading this book and speaking with you, and I'm glad I got the opportunity.
Well, that's very kind of you.